I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd fall for someone I worked with, especially not in an operating room where precision and professionalism were literally matters of life and death. But there I was, 32 years old, a surgical resident at Massachusetts General, trying desperately not to notice the way Dr. Kieran Hayes held a scalpel like it was an extension of his hand, or how his voice stayed calm and steady even when everything around us was chaos. The first time I scrubbed in with him, I was terrified. Everyone knew Dr. Hayes' reputation, youngest attending cardiothoracic surgeon in the hospital's history, brilliant, demanding, absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. I'd heard the stories from other residents about how he'd dismissed people from his OR for the smallest errors, how he expected perfection because that's what he delivered every single time. So when I got assigned to his service for my cardiothoracic rotation, I barely slept the night before. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 5 a.m, practicing how I'd introduce myself, telling my reflection to be confident, to not let him see how nervous I was. That first surgery was a coronary artery bypass graft. 4 hours of holding retractors, watching him work with this incredible focus that made everything else in the room disappear. His hands never shook, his voice never wavered. When he asked for an instrument, I made sure I anticipated what he'd need next, staying one step ahead. And at the end, when we'd closed and the patient was stable, he looked at me over his surgical mask and said, "Good work today, Dr. Reed." Just those 4 words, but I felt this warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the relief of surviving my first surgery with him. I told myself it was just respect, admiration for someone at the top of their field. That's what I kept telling myself through the next few weeks as I worked more cases with him, but respect doesn't explain why I started paying attention to the small things. Like how he always arrived at the hospital before dawn, how I'd see his office light on when I came in at 6, or how he drank his coffee black but kept honey packets in his desk drawer, or the way his eyes, which were this deep blue that reminded me of the ocean in winter, would crinkle slightly at the corners when something amused him, even though he rarely actually smiled. It was subtle at first, the way my awareness of him shifted. I'd find myself volunteering for his cases even when I was exhausted, making sure I was in the resident lounge when I knew he'd pass by on his way to the OR, staying late to review surgical videos just because he'd mentioned wanting to discuss technique. My roommate, another resident named Tyler, started giving me these knowing looks every time I'd check my pager, hoping it was Kieran calling me in for a surgery. "You know you've got it bad, right?" Tyler said one night when I came home at midnight after a long case. We were in our tiny kitchen in our even tinier apartment in Beacon Hill, and he was eating cereal straight from the box because we'd both been too busy to grocery shop. "Got what bad?" I asked, even though my stomach dropped because I knew exactly what he meant. For Dr. Hayes, you get this look on your face whenever you talk about him, like you're describing a sunset or something. I grabbed a beer from the fridge just to have something to do with my hands. "He's my attending. I respect him. That's it." Tyler laughed. "Sure, Adrian. Whatever helps you sleep at night." But that conversation stayed with me, wormed its way into my thoughts during the quiet moments. Was it that obvious? Could other people tell? Could Kieran tell? The thought made my chest tight with anxiety. This was my career. Everything I'd worked for since I decided to go to medical school. I couldn't risk it by developing feelings for an attending, especially not one as prominent as Kieran Hayes. It was unprofessional. It was inappropriate. It was a terrible idea on every possible level. Except my heart didn't seem to care about any of that. The shift happened about 6 weeks into my rotation. We'd just finished a particularly complex valve replacement, one where the patient had crashed twice on the table, and we'd spent 7 hours bringing him back, repairing damage, fighting for every heartbeat. When we finally closed, when the patient was stable and headed to ICU, I felt this wave of exhaustion and exhilaration mixed together. Kieran pulled off his surgical mask and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Like for just a moment the perfect facade had cracked and I could see how much these cases took out of him. "You did well today," he said quietly. We were alone in the scrub room washing up. "When we lost him the second time, you didn't panic, you stayed focused. That's rare." "I learned from the best," I said, and immediately felt stupid for how earnest it sounded. But he looked at me, really looked at me, and something passed between us. Something I couldn't name but could feel in the way my pulse quickened. "You want to grab coffee?" he asked. There's something I wanted to discuss about your surgical technique." We ended up at this 24-hour diner near the hospital, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. But I didn't care. I sat across from Kieran Hayes, watching him wrap his hands around a white ceramic mug, and listened as he talked about surgery and medicine and why he'd chosen cardiothoracic over all the other specialties. His voice was different outside the hospital, softer, more open. "The heart is the only organ that moves," he said, staring into his coffee like he was seeing something I couldn't. "Everything else is still, static. But the heart is alive in this way that's different. When you hold it in your hands, when you feel it beating against your palms, it's like holding the most essential truth of someone's existence, their life, condensed into this muscle that refuses to stop fighting." "That's beautiful," I said, and I meant it. Most people don't talk about surgery that way. Most people think I'm too clinical, too cold. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. "Do you think that?" "No," I said immediately. "I think you care so much that you have to maintain distance or it would destroy you. I think every patient matters to you, and that's why you demand perfection. Because anything less means you failed someone who trusted you with their life." He was quiet for a long moment, and I worried I'd overstepped, revealed too much about how closely I'd been watching him. But then he smiled, and it was a real smile this time, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "You see a lot, Dr. Reed." "Adrian," I said. "When we're not in the hospital, you can call me Adrian." "Adrian," he repeated, and the way he said my name made something warm unfurl in my chest. "Kieran." We stayed at that diner until 3 a.m, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in Dublin, how he'd moved to the States for medical school and never left, how his parents hadn't understood why he'd wanted to be a surgeon, how they'd hoped he'd take over the family business instead. I told him about my own family, about being the first person to go to medical school, about the pressure and the pride mixed together. When we finally left, walking out into the cold Boston night, he turned to me on the sidewalk. "This was nice. We should do it again sometime." "I'd like that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "But Adrian," he said, and his expression shifted, became more guarded. "At the hospital we have to maintain professional boundaries. You understand that, right?" "Of course," I said, even though disappointment washed through me. "I understand." Except I didn't really understand, not then. I didn't understand why something that felt so right had to be complicated by rules and hierarchies and professional conduct. But I nodded and went home, and lay in bed watching the sunrise through my window, replaying every moment of the night in my mind. After that, things changed between us. At the hospital, we were perfectly professional. He was Dr. Hayes, I was Dr. Reed, and we worked together with the same focused precision we always had. But there were these moments, these small glimpses of something more. The way his hand would brush mine when he handed me an instrument, how his eyes would find me across the OR. The slight smile he'd give me when I anticipated exactly what he needed before he asked. And outside the hospital we started meeting more often. Coffee turned into late dinners at quiet restaurants. Dinners turned into walks along the Charles River, talking until the sky started to lighten. He told me about his life, about the loneliness of being so focused on his career that everything else fell away, about failed relationships and missed opportunities, and the choice he'd made to prioritize medicine over everything else. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked one night. We were sitting on a bench overlooking the water, the city lights reflecting on the surface. "Sometimes," he admitted. "When I go home to an empty apartment after a 14-hour day and there's no one there, when I see other people my age with families with lives outside the hospital, but then I get to do what I do. I get to save lives, and I think maybe that has to be enough." "Does it feel like enough?" I asked quietly. He looked at me, and there was such raw honesty in his expression that it made my chest ache. It did, until recently. I knew what he meant. I could feel it too, this shift between us that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. But I didn't know what to do about it. He was my attending. There were rules, policies, ethical guidelines. If anyone found out, it could destroy both our careers, his more than mine probably. He had so much more to lose. "Kieran," I started, but he shook his head. "Don't, not yet. Let me just have this for a little while longer before we have to figure out what it means." So we existed in this strange liminal space. Not quite friends, not quite something more. Every interaction felt charged with possibility and impossibility mixed together. I'd go home after seeing him and lie awake, turning everything over in my mind. Tyler stopped asking questions, just gave me these sympathetic looks that made it clear he knew exactly what was happening. The breaking point came 3 months into my rotation. We had a case, a 15-year-old girl with a congenital heart defect that needed repair. High risk, complicated, the kind of surgery where everything could go wrong. Kieran was tense all morning, more demanding than usual, checking and rechecking every detail. I understood why. This was someone's child, someone's whole world. The surgery took 9 hours. 9 hours of holding my breath every time something shifted, every time a monitor beeped, every time Kieran's hands moved with that incredible precision to repair what nature had built wrong. And when it was done, when the girl's heart was beating strong and steady, and we knew she was going to be okay, I saw Kieran's shoulders drop with relief. In the scrub room afterward, he just stood there, hands braced against the sink, head down. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his shoulder. Just a brief touch, meant to be supportive, collegial. But he turned, and suddenly we were standing so close I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the emotional toll the case had taken. "She's going to be okay," I said softly. "You saved her life." "We saved her life," he corrected. "You were incredible in there, Adrian. I couldn't have done it without you." Something in the way he said it, the vulnerability in his voice, made everything else fall away. All the reasons why this was a bad idea, all the professional boundaries we were supposed to maintain, none of it seemed to matter in that moment. I watched his eyes drop to my lips, watched him lean in slightly, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. But then the door opened and another resident walked in, and we stepped apart like we'd been burned. Kieran left without another word, and I stood there trying to catch my breath, trying to understand what had almost just happened. I didn't see him for the rest of the day, or the next day. He seemed to be avoiding me, and when we did cross paths in the hospital, he was coldly professional, in a way that hurt more than I wanted to admit. A week went by like that, and I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd misread everything between us. Then I got a text at 11 at night, from Kieran. "Can you come over? We need to talk." His apartment was in Back Bay, a beautiful old brownstone that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. He opened the door in jeans and a t-shirt, looking more human than I'd ever seen him at the hospital. "Come in," he said, and his voice was rough, like he'd been arguing with himself. The apartment was exactly what I'd expected. Minimalist, clean, books everywhere, medical journals stacked on the coffee table, a single photograph on the mantel of what looked like his family back in Ireland. He poured us both whiskey without asking if I wanted any, handed me a glass, and then stood across the room like he needed the distance. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, the words coming out like a confession. "I've tried. God, Adrian, I've tried. But every time I see you, every time we work together, all I can think about is how much I want to be near you, how much I look forward to our conversations, how you make me laugh in ways I haven't in years, and it's completely inappropriate and unprofessional and could ruin both our careers, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." My hand was shaking as I set down the whiskey glass. "You think I haven't been feeling the same thing? You think it's been easy for me, trying to maintain professional distance when all I want is to be close to you?" "Then what do we do?" he asked, and he sounded almost desperate. "Because I can't be your attending if we're going to be something more. The hospital has policies. If anyone found out, you could lose your residency position. I could lose my job. Everything we've both worked for could be destroyed." "I know," I said. "I've thought about all of that, every possible consequence, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion, that maybe some things are worth the risk." He crossed the room then, closed the distance between us and cupped my face in his hands. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, we can't go back. Everything changes." "I'm sure," I whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything." When he kissed me, it felt like coming home, like something I'd been searching for without knowing I was looking for it. His hands were gentle, reverent, the same hands that performed miracles in the operating room now touching me like I was something precious. We stood there in his living room, the city lights filtering through the windows, and I felt this overwhelming sense of rightness despite all the complications. We talked for hours that night trying to figure out how to navigate this impossible situation. He decided he'd speak to the chief of surgery, request that I be reassigned to a different service for the remainder of my rotation. It would raise questions, but it was the only way to eliminate the direct power dynamic. We'd have to be careful, discreet, at least until I finished my residency. No one could know. "I'm tired of being alone," Kieran said quietly as we sat together on his couch, my head resting against his shoulder. "I'm tired of putting everything else first and having nothing left for myself. I don't know how to do this, how to balance a relationship with the demands of this career, but I want to try. With you." "We'll figure it out," I said. "Together." The next few months were complicated in ways I'd never imagined. Kieran transferred me to Dr. Morrison's service, which meant I barely saw him at the hospital anymore. We had to be so careful, always aware of who might see us together, what people might think. Our relationship existed in stolen moments, late nights at his apartment, early morning coffee before anyone else was awake, quiet dinners at restaurants far from the hospital where we wouldn't run into colleagues. It was hard. There were times when I missed working with him, missed the easy partnership we'd developed in the Aura Times when I wanted to reach for his hand in public and couldn't. Times when the secrecy felt like too much weight to carry. But then I'd see him smile, or feel his arms around me, or listen to him talk about his day, and I'd remember why we were doing this. Tyler figured it out, of course. Came home one night to find Kieran and me cooking dinner together in our tiny kitchen, and just nodded like he'd known all along. "I'm happy for you," he said simply. "But be careful, okay? You're playing with fire." "I know," I said, "but some things are worth burning for." The turning point came at the hospital's annual fundraising gala, one of those formal events where everyone dressed up and pretended to enjoy small talk while raising money for new equipment. I hadn't planned on going, but Tyler convinced me it would look weird if I didn't show up. Kieran would be there too, of course. All the attendings were expected to attend. I saw him across the ballroom, wearing a tuxedo that made him look unfairly handsome, talking to a group of donors. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw the longing there that matched what I was feeling. We'd been apart for 3 days because he'd been at a conference in Chicago, and I missed him with an intensity that surprised me. Later I stepped out onto one of the terraces for air, needing a break from the crowd and the noise. I was standing there looking out at the city when I felt someone come up beside me. Kieran, close enough that I could smell his cologne, far enough that we weren't touching. "I hate this," he said quietly. "Being in the same room as you and having to pretend you're just another resident." "I know, me too." "I want to be able to stand next to you in there and have people know you're with me. I want to introduce you as my partner, not just as Dr. Reed from the surgical program." I looked at him, saw the frustration and longing in his expression. "Your contract is up for renewal next year, right?" "Yes. Why?" "What if you didn't renew it? What if you took a position somewhere else, somewhere we wouldn't have to hide?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You'd be willing to leave? This is one of the best surgical programs in the country. It could make your career." "You could make my career too," I said. "The things I learned working with you, the skills you taught me, that's what matters. Not the name of the hospital on my resume. Besides, what good is a perfect career if I'm miserable?" "Adrian," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "You'd really do that? Give up everything here?" "For you?" "Yes, without question." He looked at me like I'd given him something he'd never expected to have, like hope. "There's a position opening up at Stanford, head of cardiothoracic surgery. They've been courting me for months. I kept saying no because I'd built my life here. But if you're serious, if you really mean this, maybe it's time for both of us to start something new." "I'm serious," I said. I've never been more serious about anything. We couldn't touch, couldn't do anything that might draw attention, but the way he looked at me in that moment said everything words couldn't. We were going to do this. We were going to build a life together, somewhere we didn't have to hide, somewhere we could just be. The rest of my residency passed in a blur of long shifts and stolen moments, and planning for the future. Kieran accepted the position at Stanford, gave his notice at Mass General. The news sent shockwaves through the department, everyone wondering why the brilliant Dr. Hayes would leave. But he just smiled and said it was time for a new challenge. I applied for a fellowship at Stanford, got accepted on my own merits, but knowing that I'd be able to work with Kieran again once I was no longer a resident. We found an apartment together in Palo Alto, spent weekends driving out there to look at furniture and imagine our life. On my last day at Mass General, Tyler gave me a hug and told me he was proud of me. "You found something real," he said. "Don't let it go." "I won't," I promised. Kieran and I drove across the country together, taking our time, stopping at diners and small towns, talking about everything and nothing. When we finally arrived in California, when we carried boxes into our new apartment and christened it, by ordering pizza and eating it sitting on the floor, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. "No more hiding," Kieran said, pulling me close. "No more pretending, just us." "Just us," I agreed. That was 6 months ago. Now I work alongside him again, but as a fellow, not a resident. We're colleagues and partners, and the lines aren't blurred anymore because everyone knows we don't hide. We hold hands walking to the cafeteria. We have lunch together in his office. We leave work at the end of the day and go home to the life we've built. It's not perfect. We still work insane hours. We still have cases that don't go well, patients we can't save, moments of doubt and fear, but we have each other. When Kieran comes home exhausted after a difficult surgery, I'm there. When I need someone to talk through a complicated case, he listens. We cook dinner together in our kitchen. We fall asleep tangled together in our bed. We're building something real and lasting and worth all the risk we took. Last week, we had a case together. A complex repair on a patient who reminded me of that 15-year-old girl from all those months ago. When we finished, when we knew the patient would be okay, Kieran looked at me across the operating table and smiled. Not Dr. Hayes, the renowned surgeon, but Kieran, the man I love. In the scrub room afterward, he kissed me. Just a brief kiss, nothing inappropriate for the workplace, but enough to remind me that this is real, that we made it, that sometimes the most unprofessional decision you can make turns out to be the best one. "I love you," he said, and it still sends a thrill through me every time I hear it. "I love you too," I replied. We walked out of the hospital together that evening, hands linked, heading home to the life we built together, and I thought about how far we'd come from that first day when I was terrified to scrub in with the brilliant Dr. Hayes, how I never could have imagined that the man who demanded perfection in the OR would be the same man who holds me when I can't sleep, who makes me laugh until my sides hurt, who chose me over everything else. Sometimes the heart knows things the head hasn't figured out yet. Sometimes unprofessional is just another word for honest. And sometimes taking a risk on love is the bravest surgery you'll ever perform.